On Saturday, April 9, 2022, Gambia participated and its partners, Gambia Bar Association and the Transitional Justice Working Group, deployed 411 trained accredited and non-partisan observers spread across all the 53 constituencies and 7 regions of the Gambia. Of these, 65 were mobile observers and 346 deployed as stationary observers to the polling station. Gambia participated were in every corner of the country, from the remote rural area to the urban cities, observing and reporting on the process. On Sunday, April 10, the civil society holds a session with the media on the preliminary pre-election and election findings. Marnyang, the executive director of Gambia, participated in giving remarks on the pre-election findings, said the pre-election environment was mainly calm and peaceful. There were a few reported critical incidents. The rejection of the UDP candidate for Busumbala constituency, Momodu Sabali, propelled unrest between the UDP followers and the police personnel. He said that the voter turnout in the election predicted is lower than 50% compared to the presidential election. He urged the new National Assembly to reintroduce and pass the Women Reservation Bill 2021 to guarantee the inclusion of more women and persons with disabilities in the legislature. Mr. Nyamfoda elaborated on the election day preliminary findings on the voting process, adherence to the election procedures, misconducts at polling stations, counting process, announcement and posting of results, mainstreaming participation of women as polling officials, critical incidents, and recommendations.
Persons with disability were seen at 82%, the elderly at 96%, pregnant women, nursing mothers at 91%, and sick persons at 73% were given priority to vote before others in most of the observed polling stations. 5% of the polling stations observed were not set up in locations that are accessible to persons with disabilities. Adherence to election procedures. The election day procedures as codified in the electoral guidelines and manual were likely respected in the administration of the election across most of the observed polling stations. All potential voters were asked to show their voter ID cards before being permitted to vote in all observed polling stations. Voters' fingerprints were checked prior to voting, and voters' fingers were marked with the indelible ink prior to voting in all observed polling stations. No voting by proxy was allowed, as every person's details were checked against the register of voters in all polling stations observed. Gambia observed that the polling officials and security agents conducted themselves professionally and in a non-partisan manner in the vast majority of observed polling stations. Misconduct at polling stations. Incidents of harassment and intimidation of voters were recorded in 6% of observed polling stations. Polling officials were intimidated, harassed, or assaulted at 4% of polling stations observed. In 4% of polling stations, women were particularly affected by the incidents of intimidation, harassment, or violence. This includes women as voters, polling officials, security party agents, or observers. In 2% of polling stations, observers reported that party agents attempted to influence polling officials. Counting process. In all of the observed polling stations, polling officials arranged the tokens on the counting tray, and the field counting tray was shown to the party agents, domestic and international observers present. In 4% of polling stations, there were incidents of harassment and intimidation of polling officials, party candidate agents, or observers during the counting of ballot tokens. Announcement and posting of results. For those polling stations where party agents were present, the party agents signed and received copies of the official results. APRC agents were not seen in 82% of polling stations observed. CA agents were not in 80%. GDC agents were not in 47%. NPP agents were not seen in 17% of polling stations observed. PDOS agents were not in 62%. UDP agents were not seen in 14% of polling stations that are observed, and independent candidates were not seen in 22%, and other parties were not seen in 71% of polling stations observed. Mainstreaming participation of women as polling officials. In 4% of polling stations, no officials were a woman. 29% of polling stations had one woman polling official. 48% of polling stations had two women polling officials. In 16% of polling stations, 3 of the polling officers were women. In 18% of the polling stations, the presiding officers were women. Critical incidents. Gambia Participate established a critical incident desk as part of the Electoral Data Center to receive urgent messages from its observers. Over the course of the election day, Gambia Participate received and confirmed 18 critical incidents witnessed by citizen observers, some of which were: 1. Disruption of the voting process. The voting process was disrupted in Chairman polling station in the Nyanija constituency by the incumbent candidate Amadou Kamara. Amadou visited the polling station and was granted access into the polling booth with the pretext of checking the placement of the ballot boxes, which provoked a negative reaction from a concerned voter who demanded the parliamentarian to vacate the polling booth, and this resulted to a push and pull which disrupted the voting process as there was massive chaos trying to get the parliamentarian out of the polling booth. An altercation was reported between supporters of the UDP and NPP at the Naularo polling station in central Baribu. A candidate of the UDP was allowed into the voting area by the presiding officer to observe the setup of the ballot drums. NPP supporters were, however, not happy, and this led to verbal assaults and disruption of the voting process. Recommendation. In order to improve voter participation and reduce the cost of elections, the National Assembly should accelerate the consideration of legislation to harmonize elections. We reiterate our call to IEC to publish polling unit level results on its website to increase transparency of the elections.
In conclusion, he commended the IEC for its steadfastness during this election and its continued effort to ensure integrity of the process. The security agents for their work during the electoral cycle, while encouraging them to scale up their conduct as exhibited during the presidential election. A system election methodology was employed by Gambia Practice to provide timely, independent, and credible information on the conduct of election, from the opening to the closing of polls. Their observers remained at their assigned polling station to observe the setup and opening of polls, voting, counting, and declaration of results. For Kairaba News Network, I am Makoto Mane.